Back about 10 years or so ago, my good friend and I would occasionally take trips to our family's property out in the middle of nowhere. It was fairly remote. You'd had to drive up a dirt road a few miles and couldn't access it unless you had a key to the chain on the gate. There wasn't anyone around for miles. All that was there was a trailer they had towed up and left to sleep in. The feel out there was always a little off. One day, we were wandering around the property, not really thinking of much, until about 20 minutes later when we realized we had actually been walking out into the middle of nowhere. We had no water with us and had no clue where we were. Luckily, we found a way back after a while, but neither of us could explain why we did that. I'd also take my voice recorder, and we caught up quite a few strange things on it. One day, before heading out there, we were talking about Skinwalker Ranch. It was only about a 40-minute drive from the property, so we thought, hey, why don't we go try to find it? We thought it would be cool to say that we had been there. After searching the internet, we found fairly good directions there and headed out for the night. We had a bit of trouble locating it, but after a bit of driving around, we pulled into an area that was spot on from the descriptions we had read. We stepped out of the car, and the first thing we noticed was the mass amounts of bugs swarming us. Only a few short seconds later, we had huge dogs barking, growling, and running at us. We immediately jumped back in the car and took off. We ended up staying in the area for a little longer exploring. Later that night, back at her property, we were sitting around the fire talking. All of a sudden, we started hearing barking. It was rather startling, and she immediately froze and said she had never heard barking in this area before. She isn't one to get scared easily, so her uneasiness put me on the edge. Not too long after that, there was more barking. Very slowly, we were being surrounded by what I assumed were coyotes. We both tried yelling, jumping around and throwing rocks, but that didn't seem to do any good. Never seen coyotes act this way. We were terrified and had no clue what to do. Not really wanting to stick around and find out if they'd get any closer to us, we doused the fire and flipped on our flashlights. She grabbed my hand and we booked it back into the trailer. We were both shaking by the time we made it in, and she locked the door. I don't think either of us slept that well. I heard a lot of weird sounds and felt the sense of dread the entire night. As soon as the sun started to rise, we decided to pack up and get out of there. We needed their car, and what we saw sent chills down my spine. On the driver's side car window was a huge handprint made with mud. It was easily twice the size of our hands. We looked at each other and silently agreed that we need to get the hell out of there. I'm not saying it was a skinwalker, but neither of us had been able to explain it, and I've never been back. Some background. I live in a rural county in Texas. I live in a rural suburb about 1.5 miles away from my grandparents, who live on an expansive longhorn cattle ranch. My grandparents are currently on a trip to Michigan, and they needed someone to watch their house, take care of their diabetic dog, and water the garden for a while. I love being alone and in the country, and I wouldn't be that far from my mom and stepdad, so I agreed to do it for them. The first 2 days were fine. It was on the third day that this began. It was about 8:30 at night. I had just made myself dinner, a Lunchable, and was ready to sit down in the living room and watch TV for a couple of hours until I went to bed. The recliner I was sat in at my grandparents' living room was directly beside their large glass doors, and I could see into their backyard and into their ranch from my seat. Just past the fence of the backyard were about a dozen deer, which wasn't odd considering there's an insane amount of deer where I live. I watched them for a second, when all of a sudden, I felt a wave of fear rush over me. It was like my brain stopped seeing the deer as something harmless, and instead, it became a very imposing sight. I scanned over the deer, and my eyes landed on one in particular. I noticed it, because even though it was a doe, It was a good bit taller than the others, and seemed to be oddly bulky and slightly misshapen. I watched it for about a second before, out of nowhere, its head shot up from the grass and it stared directly at me. I hadn't been moving, and both my dogs were inside with me asleep. But I knew that it was focusing in on me. We stared for about a second before it started to whip its head around in a really unnatural motion. The closest analogy I could make is when a video game glitches and the head of a character starts moving around wildly. It did this for another second before putting its head back down into the grass like nothing had happened. At this point, I knew something was very wrong, and I knew I had to get out of there. I called my mom, who was out fishing with my stepdad, and told her I was going home early because I was freaking out. I suffer from anxiety and can sometimes have panic attacks, so she understood, and I hauled ass to my car. All I grabbed was my phone, my Lunchables, and an Eeyore blanket that I had brought from my house. I don't really know why I grabbed the extra two things besides my phone, but I wasn't really thinking clearly. I'm usually a very careful driver, especially on my grandparents' shoddy gravel driveway, where I knew I had to get off their property or else I would be in real danger. My car is shitty, with the driver's side window permanently down. The entire time I drove up their half-mile-long driveway, I heard a sound coming just off from behind my car. It sounded like if a mammal tried to replicate the sound of a cicada. Very throaty and unnatural, and it was the same constant distance from my car the entire drive off the property. Right in front of the gate before going back out onto the road were a few of my grandparents' cows. I laid eyes on a black figure amongst them, and almost like an optical illusion, it changed to be a full front profile on a longhorn. I wouldn't have thought this with my eyes playing tricks on me, because I was in a panic. If it wasn't for the horns. When I saw the quote-unquote cow, it was a black figure with no horns. But within a second I spotted it, it suddenly had two giant horns on either side of its head. I managed to drive home, but I still felt extremely unsafe. My instincts were telling me that if I went inside, I'd be cornering myself. At this point, I was sitting in my driveway, near hysterics, and on the phone with one of my friends, who I'll call Hope. Hope is extremely knowledgeable with this kind of stuff, and a true believer in the supernatural, and I knew she would be the only person who wouldn't think I was losing my mind. She talked to me and calmed me down, and I explained the deer to her, and she got pretty freaked out and told me she knew what it probably was. I told her that I didn't want to know because I already had an idea as to what it might be, and her confirmation would only freak me out more. At this point, I made up my mind to go to my closest neighbor's house. I knew if I stayed alone, I would be putting myself in danger. So cue me crying and clutching an Eeyore blanket as I stroll up to my neighbor's backyard, weeping and apologizing profusely. Thankfully, my neighbors are saints. They took me inside and calmed me down. They stayed up with me for a good hour until my mom and stepdad got home from the lake, and I felt safe enough to go home. As I had finally fully calmed down, I decided to go back to the ranch with my mom to clean up the mess I had left when I booked it out of there. But by the time we were there, even remotely close to the ranch, I felt the panic return. We got halfway down the driveway before I told my mom I couldn't do it and I had to go back. Our mom was still planning to go back after she dropped me off at home, but I knew she'd be in danger if she went back alone. So I told her about the deer, and I told her I really don't want her to go back there that night, and she agreed. Hope has an older sister who is extremely well versed in the supernatural, and when she informed her of my experience, her advice was for me to never go back. This wasn't entirely realistic to me, since they are my grandparents and I did leave most of my stuff there. But I tried to take her warning as seriously as possible, and decided to greatly limit my time there and not to go back alone until my grandparents returned. The next day, which is today, at about noon, I had to go back to gather my stuff and check on my grandparents' diabetic dog and let the bigger outside dog in so he would be safe from the heat. The feeling of the place was still tense and strange, but not terrifying. Later, At about 8, I had to go back again, this time to feed the dog, let the other one out, and water the plants. I was way more hesitant about it, but my mom forced me to go. I was keeping my cool pretty well, until, as we were going down the driveway, I saw a deer standing in the road. I immediately felt the fear of the previous night and started freaking out, telling my mom that I couldn't do it and that she had to turn around. As I was freaking out with my mom distracted, trying to calm me down, this fucking deer arched his back, like when a cat stretches. That tipped me over the edge into full hysterics, but my mom still refused to take me home. A mom went inside my grandparents' house and I stayed in the truck and called Hope again. I told her what I saw. She tried to calm me down, but nothing really worked. As I was freaking out on the phone, I saw a black shadow dart into and then out of the rearview mirror. That was it. I called my mom and was screaming for her to come back inside and take me home. Even during normal panic attacks, it never reaches this point. My mom was screaming so harshly at my vocal cords hurt. She tried to convince me to come inside, and eventually, she decided to take me home, and I was hyperventilating and sobbing until the moment I arrived back. And at this point, I'm terrified and I don't know what to do. I've never experienced anything like this before, and although I hope this is going to be an isolated sense of occurrences, I can't be for sure. For now, I'm going to try to stay away from my grandparents' ranch. That really isn't realistic. I could use any advice you're willing to give. I work as a paramedic in Louisiana. Needless to say, after being in this profession for a while, you'll see your fair share of creepy things. However, nothing I've experienced could top this. The unit that I work on is quite rural compared to most others in our fleet. It was a busy night, so we were posted at a halfway point between our station and another in town to cover both parts of the area. We'd like to post off the road about a quarter of a mile into the woods so we would not be bothered while we were there. It was late, so my partner and I had gone to the back of our unit because there is much more room to stretch out and relax in the back. My partner was asleep, and I was messing around on my phone. I felt something bump into the side of our unit, shaking the whole truck. Now, our trucks are heavy, and it would take a substantial amount of force to shake it like I had felt. I woke my partner and told him, but he brushed it off, thinking I may have been dreaming or something. Then it happened again. He immediately shot up and looked out the window, and I did the same. We couldn't see a thing outside, and it was too dark. We made the decision to cut on the unit floodlights, which illuminate the entire area around the truck. I moved from the window to hit the button, and my partner stayed behind looking out the window. As soon as I turned them on, my partner gasped and jumped back from the window. I could see it as well. The light from the back of that unit illuminated an approximately 7-foot-tall creature. It looked like it was turned around, but I could not make out a face. Most of it was hairless, but I did see some matted patches of hair here and there on its body. It had extremely long, skinny arms that appeared to drag the ground behind it. Parts of the body that were hairless appeared to be gray and wrinkly. It wasn't moving, just standing there with its back towards us. We decided to radio dispatch and told them to get a police unit to our location as there was a large animal outside of our unit. About 5 minutes later, we saw the lights from the police unit come from down the road. The creature looked in the direction of the lights, turned its body, and very calmly walked into the woods. The officer walked up to our units and opened the door. We explained to him what was going on. He said that he didn't see anything as he was pulling up, and whatever it was gone now. It's been a few months since seeing this creature, and I've never seen or heard anything like it, and I've not seen it since. Granted, we don't park in that area anymore. Needless to say, we have stayed in the front of the truck now when posting, ready to floor it and drive away if anything like that happens again. A few months back, I was on a routine third shift. I work as a police officer in a very small town in Ohio. It is currently the middle of fall. I'm not going to say where. People can find it pretty easily. Anyway, I was on night patrol, driving in my patrol car. Most nights, we are required to get out of our cruisers to check areas our cruisers can't fit. There's a super long, almost 2-mile bike path we are supposed to walk down. Well, one night as usual, I got out and walked the path. Usually, we do this to make sure no one is hurt or overdosed. My flashlight was dimmed during the walk, since I forgot to put it on the charger earlier that day. About 1 mile into the walk, I start to feel very strange. Not a typical gut feeling. A feeling that you know something is wrong or something is about to go wrong. I began to hear leaves crunching, turning in every direction the leaves would break. My light is so dim it is hard to see much of anything. I continue trying to get this walk over. I start to speed up. In doing so, I must have triggered something's instinct. Every time I sped up, the breaking of leaves would get louder and continue with my pace. I get to the point where I know something is there, so I just stop and listen. I waited for 5 minutes, hoping to catch some kids playing a prank or a fellow officer trying to get a laugh. But nothing. The sounds have stopped. I began shining my light all around me, slowly turning my light from the tree to tree. Then I noticed something odd. I passed by it the first time. I shined my light back in the direction I noticed from earlier. I can see something, but at the time, it was hard to make out. The only difference I noticed was the contrast in colors. Old gray and black with red and orange leaves and a brown tree. I shined my light up from it. Then, 2 huge glowing eyes. Nothing like I have ever seen before. I have seen deer, wolves, and other animal eyes that reflect light, but nothing like this. I hesitated, almost drawing my firearm, but I stopped myself, knowing that I could get myself in trouble if it was a prankster. This thing took 1 step out from behind the tree. I got a whole body view. It was covered in feathers, extremely tall, and didn't appear to be completely human. I noticed it had hands like a human, but it having feathers that looked almost forced into the skin. I start to back up. Thankfully, it never moved more than when it did earlier. I was frozen in fear, too scared to move, but I snapped out of it when dispatch radioed. Police 1 checkup. The sound of the radio snapped me out of my trance. I started walking backwards, very quickly, not taking my eyes off this thing one time. It felt like forever, but I finally got back out of those woods. My cruiser was in the clearing. I bolted as fast as I could to it, not looking back until I got back in. I looked into the wood line from where I came in. Then I could see this thing's whole body. Head shaped like a demonic owl. Head laying tilt, just staring with its huge eyes. Its body, covered in some parts by feather, other by skin that appeared to be falling off, like it was rotting. Then a terrible odor came through. So powerful, it is engraved into my memory. I unlocked my cruiser, crawled in and locked my doors. I attempted to shine my spotlight and brights at it, but it ran back into the woods, letting out a scream that was like no other. I could feel the creatures below, rattle my insides, leaving me almost sick to my stomach. After it ran, I drove back up to my station, sitting inside to recap what had just happened. I asked my fellow officers about it sometime later, but got very odd responses. I was being told to never look where the noises came from. It would be better if I just ignored them altogether. I was confused at this point, wondering if they had seen it themselves, but I was never given a definitive answer, just told to keep my light charged and my eyes forward. My name is Carlos. I am now currently 14 years old. This sighting happens while I was backpacking in rural Arkansas, high in the mountains. Me and my friend, which for confidential reasons, I won't say their names, but let's call them Jerome, John, Caleb, and my crush who I will call Laura, went backpacking with my fellow church youth. On the very first day backpacking, I noticed how quiet it was. I mean, like the forest was empty, kinda. It was just silent. But I ignored it and put it off, as maybe it was just very quiet here. But being a country boy, I should have known better. After long and tiring 5 hours of walking, we finally decided to stop and rest for the night. I will explain how the surrounding area looked like, because it is important. We were separated into 2 groups, guys and girls. Us guys, we slept in a clearing near a massive hill, while the girls slept under a ridge of a cliff. And on the right of both camps was a river, also in between the camps was a ravine. Us guys, being young and stupid, decided to explore before it was too dark. We ended up finding this cave around 30 feet away from our camp. After exploring the cave, which was empty, we decided to go eat dinner. For some reason, we didn't make a fire. After eating, our counselor told us that we needed to have a buddy system when we used the bathrooms because it was hunting season. After the meeting, we went to bed. That night, I woke up with a strong urge to pee. Being the good friend I am, I didn't wake up any of my sleeping friends as I climbed up that massive hill to pee behind a tree or near the top. Now, I know that was dumb, but hey, you'd rather go pee in a ravine. Now, which sounds better? As I was going up, I heard a branch break, but I brushed it off as some kind of nocturnal animal. During mid-pee, I heard a low growl. It was like a guttural growl. I was in mid-pee, I couldn't stop. As soon as I finished peeing, I raced down the hill and made the mistake of turning around. I saw a massive, easily 6 foot tall, very pale humanoid looking creature with huge black eyes which were fixated on me. I immediately ran to my tent and passed out from fright. The next morning as we were leaving, I saw in that cave a pale looking face peering out at me. My friends didn't believe me. But one of my friends came up to me and told me that he saw it because he takes medication for his depression and he thought he was hallucinating. It was around 11 p.m. at night. We wanted to visit a graveyard, so we ended up going to Double Butte Cemetery near South Mountain in Phoenix. As we were pulling in, a coyote dashed across the car and ran toward the mountains. It looked weird, like one of those overbred, incest German shepherds that are all short and hunched over. But I didn't think too much of it. We parked and walked away from the car and explored the graveyard. There were no sign of people or coyotes, but whenever we walked near a bush or a tree, we heard rustling. But we figured it was just some sort of rodent or bat. When we were done, we walked toward the car to leave, but we saw a cool little gated sanctuary garden type thing. So we went in there and sat for a little. All of a sudden, we heard what sounded like a weird mix of a laugh, scream, and a howl. I was confused to what this humanist scream was at first. So my mind immediately translated it to multiple coyotes, a pack. We were about to leave, and then we saw 4 sets of glowing eyes, crouching and coming toward us. Fast. I still figured an angry coyote pack, so we ran to the car. After being safe in the car, we got a little more ballsy and tried to find them. They were nowhere to be seen. I saw 3, maybe 4 shadows of human figures on the other side of the graveyard from the car. I thought to myself, wow, there are people here this late? I wonder why we didn't see or hear them. It's a pretty small, flat and treeless graveyard. Basically, just dirt and desert. So I'm pretty positive we would have known if there were others. Their shadows disappear for a while, but I'm still looking toward that direction. That's when I saw the weirdest figure, hunched over, walking in the most awkward way. The way its body moved was swift and unnatural. It was the same direction where I saw the people. We drove over to that direction and found nothing and left. We get home and we noticed the car scratched up everywhere, like a coyote was going crazy on top of the car. The scratches were long and dragged in different directions, and a few dirt paw prints all over the car. We had a car wash the next day, and the car was completely untouched before, and I'm pretty sure of that. We also left a McFlurry in the trunk of the car, which was untouched and not moved. If coyotes got on the car, it definitely would have been destroyed, considered how dramatic the scratches were. So yeah, I'm wondering if what we saw were skinwalkers. The graveyard is also near a reservation, and it seemed like a lot of Arizona pioneers and natives were buried there. Here in Canada, I have in-laws way up north in a place called the Northwest Territories. They're native and have a lot of weird tales from their community. They have families spread all over the north, a lot of them whom are in Alberta as well, and will play into this story. So, it was a typical winter night, maybe 10-ish years ago at my in-laws' grandparents' house. Not that late or anything, but very dark due to that time of year, and it was way too cold to be outside. At least -45 Celsius, or -49 degrees. Everyone was just out hanging out and watching TV. Kids were playing, and typical average kind of night, you know. Suddenly, there is knocking at the door. Hard, persistent knocking. This was immediately strange, as they live away, outside of any town, with kilometers between neighbors, and unannounced guests are almost unheard of. Their grandparents are visibly concerned and tell them not to answer the door. The knocking became harder, and the guests began to speak loudly, stating that they were Auntie so-and-so, and that they had been invited over. The kids wanted to answer the door to see their auntie. Apparently, it sounded exactly like her. So their grandpa had to block the kids from going near the door and tell them to get away from the door and the windows as well. The knocking became known to pounding, and the guests started yelling and screaming angrily to be let in. Eventually, it stopped and the guest was gone. The next morning, there were no tracks outside in the snow, and no signs of a vehicle had been in the area. This auntie lived in Alberta and had made no plans to visit. Anyway, that's about it. Not much for excitement, but that kind of shit is weirdly common out here in some places. Believe it or not, Wendigo is a major piece of folklore in that family as well, and they refuse to talk about it out of fear of drawing one in. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona. Many times, when you would ask natives about skinwalkers, they would get upset and would mostly refuse to even mention the word. My aunt went to a basketball game with the team my uncle was training. She stepped in since he was out sick. The game was on a reservation, and they were on a dirt road heading home around 8 at night. And she said an old woman started floating next to the van, and everyone started to scream. She told everyone in the car to pray, and she said that's when the old woman floated off into the dark. Nobody stopped praying until they got to the meeting lot where she dropped off the kits. Another story was from my friend Raiden. He told me that they were at his grandma's house watching TV at night when he heard knocking on the door. He went to go answer it and his grandparents yelled at him not to, saying that nobody comes out this late except for skinwalkers. He said after that, they heard knocking on the walls and windows, and the windows had boards that you could shut from the inside, so he never saw anything. He said the next day, he heard the walker get on top of their trailer outside and start thomping on it. Next day they came out, the roof was dented to hell. My friend Anthony told me a story of how him and his brothers were outside with their uncle, and they saw a skinwalker with blood-red eyes and pale white skin, but the face looked like a pig's. They said they sat there frozen. And they said that their uncle also froze in his spot after making direct eye contact with the walker, and the walkers started walking towards them, and they said that they grabbed their uncle and dragged him inside and locked everything and called the cops. Some pretty terrifying shit. I wouldn't go searching for any of these things. It was around 10 at night, off a little ways from Ocean City, Maryland. It was Mother, her friend, and my sister and I. We were driving home from our vacation, and I asked if we could take the back roads. I always loved seeing the woods at night, and it was the scenic route. We were driving down, and although I was one who asked for the trees, I was ironically on my phone texting and listening to music. We eventually came to a stretch of road that I didn't pay much attention to. It was boring, but I occasionally looked up every now and then as I did the entire ride. It was a straight path forward with nothing but street lights, so we were driving and driving. As we crossed under the lights, it was almost relaxing. I went into a half-sleep trance. Then I suddenly woke up, and everything was fine. More lights as we drove by. No one was talking. My mom's boyfriend wasn't asleep, but there were no muffled conversations. Everything seemed calm. But I had this sudden awareness we were in the middle of the woods. It was dark and around 11:30 or 12. Without streetlights, you couldn't see anything but the stars. I immediately felt very paranoid. I turned my phone on and listened to the music. Then we entered back to another stretch of light and drove on, and I started to feel a little bit better. This part is strange, because it was as if something told me to go to my phone, as if there was a notification. I checked and there was nothing there, and then I noticed something in my obscured vision. There were about 4 lights up ahead that were turned off, in an area where the road kind of turns. It was a fairly wooded area, and you couldn't see much without the light, so we slowed down. I didn't pay much attention to it, but this next part sticks with me. As we slowly approached the next light that was on, something crawled out from the woods and into the light. I looked up and thought it was a deer at first, but it kept moving out. It was limping, but when it fully emerged, what I saw was truly bone-chilling. A naked, ash-white skinny man crawled out on all fours. It stopped, and as I saw it, it turned its head at us. Its eyes were deep charcoal black. We sped up fast and started driving. It wasn't human. As we drove past it, it jumped over our car weightlessly, defying physics. My mom's Mercedes had 2 sunroofs. Although it was a blur, I got a close look at it. As it passed over the car, it landed behind us and faded into the back. The scary part was, when it jumped over our car, our sunroof was open.